Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest practices from medieval France, the sleepers' cages. Now, before you picture a cozy little nest for a peaceful night's sleep, think again. These beds were nothing like anything you'd want to relax in after a long day. Instead, they were literally cages, designed to keep people locked up while they slept. Picture this, you, tired from a long day, ready for some rest, only to be confined in a cage, unable to move freely. You probably won't survive this story without a little shiver down your spine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're from and what time it is there. I'm always curious about how far these odd stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The concept of the sleeper's cage sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? But in medieval France, this bizarre practice was real. Unlike today, when we value comfort and freedom in our sleep spaces, medieval people weren't as concerned with comfort as they were with protection. Yes, protection. The sleeper's cage was meant to keep you safe, but from what? Was it burglars, restless sleepwalkers, or perhaps something else altogether? The reasons behind this strange practice are not entirely clear, but it was definitely a part of life for certain groups of people during this time. Historians still argue whether these cages were used primarily for security reasons or if they had other, more mystical purposes. Some suggest that they were meant to prevent physical harm during the night, like falling out of bed or even from malicious spiritual forces. Others believe it was about controlling movement and keeping people in a state of obedience while they slept. Either way, these cages weren't about luxury, they were a far cry from the plush mattresses and soft blankets we know today. Now, let's take a step back and try to understand how the sleeper's cage came to be. The idea of such a contraption might seem ridiculous now, but in medieval France, it wasn't that unusual. These cages were used primarily during the 16th and 17th centuries. Back then, medieval society was obsessed with security, both physical and spiritual. There was this ever-present fear of danger, robbers, fires, thieves, and even ghosts were part of everyday life. People didn't exactly have the kind of security systems we take for granted today. So, what better way to protect yourself while you slept than by literally locking yourself in? But the reason behind these cages wasn't just about security, it had deeper roots in how medieval people viewed their personal space and privacy. The sleepers' cages were often seen as a method of protection, designed not only to prevent thieves from entering but also to ensure that the sleeper wouldn't wander during the night. Imagine a time when the streets were dark, dangerous, and filled with potential threats. It might sound odd now, but in this context, being safely locked inside a metal or wooden cage while you slept made sense. These cages kept people from being too vulnerable in the unpredictable world around them. But there's a twist. The cages weren't just for ordinary folk. The wealthy and nobility also found these contraptions appealing. You'd think they'd have the luxury of a good lock on their door, right? Yet, even nobles had a taste for these iron and wooden enclosures. They might seem like something out of a horror film, but for them, the cages symbolized security, status, and, believe it or not, sanctity. The wealthy were no strangers to the same fears of thieves, but they also had another layer to consider, their status. By locking themselves into a cage, they showcased their wealth and sophistication through the ownership of such an unusual, albeit eerie, object. Historians still debate whether this practice was truly embraced by all levels of society or whether it was more symbolic in nature. Was it an actual physical safeguard, or was it just a reflection of the deeply ingrained paranoia of the times? Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of these contraptions. Imagine crawling into a bed not made of soft sheets, but rather cold metal bars or hard wooden slats. The design of the sleepers' cages wasn't exactly about comfort, it was about control. Some of these cages were small, barely big enough for someone to stretch out fully, while others were larger, providing a little more room for the sleeper. In either case, the structures were built with one thing in mind, to restrain. The idea wasn't to offer a restful night's sleep, but rather to limit movement during the night. The cages themselves were typically constructed from metal or wood, and many were fitted with a lock or latch. This wasn't just for keeping people inside, the lock symbolized authority and control, reinforcing the idea that the sleeper was not in full command of their own environment. The iron bars or wooden frames were harsh, unforgiving, and uncomfortable, unlike the cozy, plush beds we're accustomed to today. Some designs included small openings or vents, allowing the person inside to breathe and move just enough to survive the night. But the designs weren't all the same. Some cages were more elaborate, featuring intricate carvings and symbols, possibly reflecting the social status of the person inside. Others were more utilitarian, simple, no-frills contraptions designed only for one thing: protection, not comfort. A few even had small benches or reclining surfaces inside, so the person could at least rest in some kind of manner. But make no mistake, the goal was never relaxation. These cages were more about preserving safety, or at least the illusion of it. Historians still argue whether these cages were intended as a practical measure for protecting people during sleep, or if they were more about enforcing discipline and obedience, particularly for those who were seen as being prone to wandering. Some believe they were part of a larger trend of controlling people's behavior, while others suggest that they were a direct response to the violence and danger that was common in medieval France. Either way, they represented a strange and discomforting approach to nighttime safety. As you can imagine, sleeping in one of these cages wasn't exactly the ideal end to a long day. The whole concept of sleeping in a confined, enclosed space seems foreign to us now, where comfort reigns supreme. But in medieval France, the purpose of these cages was about far more than just being a strange alternative to a mattress. It was about ensuring safety in a chaotic, often dangerous world. You might think these cages were only for peasants or those at the lowest rungs of society, but you'd be wrong. The nobility sometimes embraced them, too. It's hard to picture a noble lord or lady lying in a restrictive, uncomfortable cage, but the practice wasn't limited to common folk. In fact, the nobility often opted for elaborate versions that reflected their wealth and power. These cages weren't just utilitarian, they were carefully crafted with fine materials, often adorned with intricate carvings or covered in gilded accents. The more elaborate the cage, the more it symbolized both the wealth and the vigilance of its owner. It was a unique combination of both comfort and control, though not in the way we usually think of comfort. For the nobility, the cages could have also served as status symbols, similar to the way some people today might invest in a lavish home security system. While most people would never dream of sleeping in such a restricted space, the rich and powerful found a certain comfort in knowing they were shielded from any possible threat, whether it came in the form of thieves, political enemies, or even supernatural fears. In many ways, the cages symbolized an almost obsessive need for security in an era rife with threats, from physical danger to unseen spiritual forces. Historians still debate whether the nobility's use of sleepers' cages was more about personal security or societal expectations. Were they genuinely worried about thieves, or was it a form of social conformity, a way to show that even the wealthiest weren't above the perceived dangers of the day? Whatever the reason, these cages were not just an oddity, they were a practical solution, or perhaps a cultural response, to the instability and uncertainty of the time. As we dive deeper into the design and purpose of these sleepers' cages, it becomes clear that they were more than just uncomfortable beds, they were statements of control. Imagine yourself in one of these cages, with your movements severely restricted. But what if you were someone who wasn't even sleeping alone? Yes, some families used these cages for their children, too. The idea was to ensure that children wouldn't roll out of bed or sleepwalk, common concerns in a time when diseases like the plague and infections were widespread, and people weren't as aware of the medical causes behind these behaviors. The cage, then, wasn't just about keeping someone locked in, it was about keeping them contained, in more ways than one. In some cases, the cages were not just for one person. Families, particularly those who lived in crowded homes, would use larger, communal cages. While it might seem ridiculous to us now, the rationale behind this was rooted in practicality. Medieval homes, especially in poorer areas, didn't have the luxury of large, separate rooms. So, keeping everyone, children and adults, secure and in place during the night was as much about convenience as it was about safety. Imagine trying to sleep with several other people, all within a confined space, with the only thing separating you from your neighbor being a set of bars. It sounds uncomfortable, but for the medieval world, it was a pragmatic solution to a difficult problem. The cages, in a sense, reflected the social norms of the time. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, and personal space was a concept not many could grasp. Being confined in a cage during the night wasn't an unusual way of life, it was merely another facet of medieval society's effort to control the chaos of life. The medieval world wasn't a place where individual freedom was prioritized, it was a place of strict hierarchies, where the concept of privacy was often sacrificed for the sake of community survival. Historians still argue whether the use of sleepers' cages was simply a practical solution for the poor or if they were adopted as part of a broader cultural mindset that placed higher value on safety and obedience than on comfort or personal space. Some suggest that the cages were a necessary evil, a tool to combat the unpredictability of life. Others believe they reflect a society deeply invested in control, where even sleep was not exempt from the watchful eyes of authority. Now, let's take a step back and look at how the cages themselves were constructed. Imagine a dark medieval room, with the faint smell of wood and metal filling the air. The cages weren't exactly built for comfort. They were functional, harsh, and, to modern eyes, rather ominous. The walls of these cages were typically made from thick metal bars or sturdy wood, designed to keep the sleeper inside and prevent any movement that might seem undesirable. Picture yourself inside, there's no plush mattress, no soft linens, just a cold, hard surface and the confines of the cage pressing in on all sides. The iron cages were often constructed with bars that were closely spaced to prevent the person inside from slipping out. The design was simple yet effective, too simple, really. These were not elaborate, cushioned beds that offered comfort, these were meant to be stark and utilitarian. For someone lying in one, the concept of sleep as a restful escape would be far from their mind. It was more about enduring the night, perhaps with just a small opening for ventilation. The wooden cages, though slightly more comfortable, were still far from welcoming. These were often used by the poorer classes, as they were cheaper to make than their iron counterparts. But, regardless of material, both types served the same grim purpose. What's even more fascinating is that some of these cages came with features designed to lock people in place. The doors were sometimes fitted with a secure lock or latch, ensuring that once the sleeper was inside, they couldn't escape until morning. Some versions had a small window or opening through which the person could breathe or even be fed during the night. These small features hinted at a belief that the person inside was, in some way, a prisoner, whether to society, to the environment, or perhaps to themselves. For all intents and purposes, the sleep inside these cages was not voluntary. Historians still debate whether these cages were an expression of the medieval fascination with order and control or whether they were born from more pragmatic needs, like security and safety. Some argue that they were a response to the fear of nighttime dangers, while others suggest they were a social control mechanism, a way of ensuring obedience through confinement, even in sleep. As strange as it may sound, the use of these sleepers' cages was not just limited to one class or group of people. In fact, it was a practice that spanned across different layers of society, from the wealthy elite to the poorest peasants. In medieval France, it was not unusual for both ends of the social spectrum to use these devices, though the reasons for using them varied significantly depending on one's social status. While peasants and laborers likely used these cages purely for security reasons, the nobles often viewed them as a symbol of their authority and sophistication. Take, for example, a noble family's version of the sleeper's cage. Theirs would have been a far more refined, elaborate construction compared to the crude cages used by peasants. Some of these noble cages were adorned with fine woodwork or intricate metalwork, displaying the owner's wealth and taste. The cages of the elite were often fitted with softer interiors, sometimes even including small cushions or mattresses, making the experience of being confined a bit more tolerable, though still far from what we would consider comfortable by today's standards. In some cases, the nobility used these cages for what could be considered more symbolic reasons. Rather than out of a necessity for safety, some nobles used the cages to enforce their discipline and command over those in their household, including servants and children. The presence of a cage in the noble home might have been seen as an indicator of control, showing that even within the walls of a luxurious estate, discipline reigned supreme. In a society where rank and power were of utmost importance, these cages served as an outward sign that no one was exempt from order and structure, no matter their social standing. Historians still debate whether the nobility's use of sleepers' cages was a genuine necessity for security, or if it was more about the cultural trends of the time. Some suggest it was simply a status symbol, akin to the ostentatious home security systems we see today. Others argue that the cages were a necessity, particularly in times of political unrest or social turmoil, when any individual, regardless of wealth, was at risk of being attacked or abducted. Either way, the cages became a fascinating, if peculiar, feature of both peasant and noble households alike. Let's take a closer look at what it was like inside one of these cages. Picture yourself lying there, inside the cramped space, only a few inches between you and the hard wooden or metal bars. There's no sense of personal space. It's the kind of environment that forces you to be aware of every movement, as you're trapped in a tight, almost suffocating space. Your arms might be pressed against the bars, and any slight turn of your body is impeded by the design of the cage. Sleep, which for most of us is a peaceful escape, becomes an endurance test. Inside, there's very little room to move, and if you're one of the unlucky souls sleeping in one of the more basic wooden versions, you're looking at a rough night. Imagine the hardwood against your back, the claustrophobia setting in, and the constant reminder that you are bound to your place until the morning. Some versions of the cage were built with just enough space to lie down, while others were so tight that the sleeper would be forced to curl up uncomfortably, unable to stretch out fully. In some instances, people inside the cages might have been left with minimal ventilation, with just small holes or slats for air to pass through. This would have created a stifling, uncomfortable environment, making sleep even more elusive. And let's not even get into the lack of privacy. Being trapped inside a cage with little to no room for personal comfort must have been both mentally and physically exhausting. Whether you were a noble trying to enforce discipline or a peasant trying to avoid the nighttime dangers of the world, the experience was likely far from restful. Historians still argue whether the discomfort of the cages was part of their effectiveness. Some suggest that the very fact of being uncomfortable made them effective tools for control. After all, discomfort often forces people to stay still and obedient. Others believe the cages were used for safety first, with the discomfort being a side effect of practical design rather than an intentional means of control. But one thing is for certain, sleeping in a cage, no matter the reason, was never meant to be restful. As we continue to explore the practical and cultural implications of these medieval sleepers' cages, it's important to understand how they fit into the larger fabric of daily life. In a world where danger lurked around every corner, from physical threats like thieves to more intangible fears like ghosts and spirits, people were constantly seeking ways to protect themselves. The cages were a reflection of this deep-seated anxiety. But the need for protection didn't stop with the body. People were equally concerned with safeguarding their souls. Religion played a significant role in the way people viewed their safety, and the Church's influence on sleep rituals during this time cannot be understated. The medieval period was marked by a strong belief in the supernatural, and the idea of spirits, demons, and otherworldly forces was a part of everyday life. The cage was thought to be a spiritual protector, a way to shield oneself from any malevolent forces that might invade during sleep. Whether it was a thief in the night or an evil spirit, the cage was seen as a barrier to the unknown. Some even believed that the confined space would prevent sleepwalking or other behaviors that could make one vulnerable to these supernatural forces. While this belief in spiritual protection was strong, it also shows just how deeply embedded fear was in medieval society. People didn't just sleep in cages for physical protection, they believed they were also guarding themselves from forces beyond their understanding. Even more peculiar is the belief that these cages, by restricting movement, could keep the sleeper safe from dreams or visions that might disrupt their peace of mind. It was a time when religion and superstition blended together in practical ways, influencing even the simplest daily activities, like how one slept. Historians still debate the extent to which the belief in supernatural forces drove the use of sleepers' cages. Some scholars suggest that it was simply a practical way of preventing unwanted movement during sleep, while others argue that the cages were part of a broader societal attempt to control fear and chaos. Regardless of the exact reasons, it's clear that these cages were not just about keeping someone physically contained, they were about providing a sense of security in a world that was often chaotic and frightening. As we continue our exploration of medieval sleepers' cages, let's dive into the influence of religion on these nighttime contraptions. In medieval France, sleep was not just about resting, sleeping was viewed as a spiritual act. The very nature of the act was believed to be a moment when the soul could wander or be vulnerable to the forces of good and evil. This belief created an environment where people felt that sleep needed to be controlled and safeguarded, especially since the hour of rest was viewed as a time when one's body and soul were especially susceptible to external influences. The Church played a central role in shaping the medieval mindset around sleep. Church doctrine often emphasized purity of the body, and during the medieval period, purity was closely tied to restraint, discipline, and control. The idea of sleeping in a cage fit this idea perfectly. If the body could be confined and restrained during sleep, then the soul could rest without fear of wandering or being contaminated by demonic influence. In fact, some religious texts during this period suggested that the confinement of one's body during sleep would ensure that the soul could rest undisturbed. The Church might have even endorsed these practices, viewing them as a way of maintaining piety and protecting one's soul. But beyond spiritual protection, the medieval religious culture also believed that people were more vulnerable to dreams and visions at night. These visions could be prophetic, disturbing, or even disturbing enough to cause harm to one's mental well-being. The fear of dreams that could lead to dangerous or disturbing outcomes was so strong that it became another reason why sleepers' cages were adopted. The belief was that by limiting one's physical movement and controlling the space in which one slept, a person could prevent the harmful effects of vivid dreams and nightmares. There was no room for luxury in sleep, the focus was on protecting both body and soul from the unseen dangers of the night. Historians still debate how much influence the Church had over the widespread use of sleepers' cages. Some scholars suggest that the cages were purely practical devices, with the religious implications only coming later as a cultural justification. Others argue that the cages were an integral part of the religious landscape, serving as a physical manifestation of spiritual discipline. Either way, it's clear that these medieval contraptions were far more than simple devices, they were a blend of practicality, religious belief, and the anxiety-filled world of medieval France. As we move forward in exploring the bizarre practice of sleepers' cages, let's now consider the decline of these unusual contraptions. The use of sleepers' cages didn't last forever. By the end of the 17th century, as the Renaissance spread throughout Europe, and especially as the Enlightenment began to take root, the use of these medieval security devices started to fade. As society began to evolve and move away from the deeply ingrained superstitions and fears of the past, so too did the methods for dealing with these fears. One of the driving forces behind this shift was the changing attitudes toward personal freedom and privacy. As the Enlightenment brought new philosophical ideas, there was a growing emphasis on individual rights and self-determination. The notion that someone could be physically confined during their sleep began to seem outdated and oppressive. Sleep, which had been viewed as a vulnerable time for both the body and soul, became less about protection and more about personal autonomy and relaxation. People began to realize that their beds, rather than being prisons, should be places of rest and comfort. At the same time, the rise of more modern security measures began to replace the need for sleepers' cages. The invention of locks, doors, and more secure living environments meant that people didn't need to confine themselves during the night for safety's sake. The cages, which were once symbols of power, control, and protection, eventually became relics of a bygone era, their once prominent role in medieval life slipping into obscurity. Historians still debate whether the decline of sleepers' cages was purely a result of societal progress or if they were also linked to changes in religious attitudes. Some argue that the changing ideas about sleep were influenced more by scientific discoveries and advancements in psychology, which made the idea of restricting movement at night seem barbaric. Others believe that the shift in religious attitudes toward the body and soul may have played a part in the move away from such extreme practices. Either way, it's clear that the sleepers' cages became a forgotten piece of medieval history, gradually giving way to the more modern, and far more comfortable, beds we use today. As we look back on the peculiar history of sleepers' cages, it's impossible to ignore the lasting cultural and architectural legacy of these odd contraptions. While they may have been phased out by the late 17th century, the influence of medieval sleep practices can still be seen in modern architecture and design. The concept of personal space, privacy, and security that these cages symbolized has evolved into today's obsession with home security, from locked doors to alarm systems. We might not be sleeping in cages anymore, but the need to protect our private spaces has remained strong, if not even more pronounced. Even more fascinating is how medieval practices like these shape our modern understanding of what it means to rest. In many ways, the medieval sleep experience, often uncomfortable and physically restrained, was a reflection of the rigid social structures and rigid control of the time. The fear of the unknown, whether it was thieves, spirits, or other worldly dangers, forced people to take extreme measures to ensure safety while they slept. Today, while we may not be as fearful of ghosts or robbers, we continue to find ways to protect ourselves, often to an extreme degree, whether that's through physical security measures or psychological tactics designed to ensure we feel safe when we sleep. Interestingly, even in modern times, you can still find echoes of the medieval obsession with controlling sleep. If you take a look at historical preservation sites or even visit old castles, you might find remnants of these medieval cages still on display. In some cases, they're preserved as curious historical artifacts, a stark reminder of how different our attitudes towards sleep once were. The more you look at them, the more you realize that these devices weren't just about safety, they were a product of their time, a reflection of the paranoia and societal needs of an era steeped in uncertainty. Historians still debate whether these remnants of medieval culture still carry lessons for us today. Some suggest that our modern obsession with privacy and personal space stems from these earlier practices, while others argue that the evolution of sleep and personal security has come a long way and that we no longer need to look back at these grim devices for insight. Regardless, there's no denying that the bizarre practice of sleepers' cages serves as an eerie link to the past, offering us a glimpse into a world where sleep was anything but restful. As we wind down through this strange journey into medieval France, it's important to reflect on what the practice of sleepers' cages really tells us about the era. Beyond the bars, the discomfort, and the anxiety of sleeping in such a restrictive environment, these cages reveal a great deal about the people who used them. They were products of a time when fear, both real and imagined, shaped daily life in profound ways. For the medieval mind, safety was never a given. It had to be constructed, maintained, and, most importantly, protected at all costs. The medieval world was a place where people lived under constant threat, whether from natural disasters, the threat of invasion, or even supernatural fears. Society wasn't like it is today. Modern security, laws, and social structures didn't exist in the same way, and personal space or freedom was often sacrificed for the sake of survival. Sleeping in a cage, although uncomfortable, was a way to bring order to an otherwise chaotic and unsafe world. It wasn't just about being locked in, it was about having control over your environment in an unpredictable time. While the use of sleepers' cages faded, the fears they represented didn't disappear overnight. Even in the modern age, our anxieties manifest in various forms, such as the popularity of home security systems or our reliance on digital locks. We've moved from literal cages to virtual ones, but the underlying need for control and protection remains the same. Whether we sleep in a gilded cage in the castle of a noble or in a locked, secure home today, the core human instinct to protect oneself, particularly during rest, hasn't changed. Historians still argue whether the fear of the unknown was ever as severe as it seemed, or whether it was exaggerated by the medieval mindset. Were these cages an essential form of protection, or were they merely a cultural reflection of a society that viewed danger and the unknown through a lens of superstition and paranoia? Perhaps, in the end, it doesn't matter. What's fascinating is how these ancient fears have evolved into modern forms of security. Today, while we may no longer lock ourselves in metal or wooden cages, we still find ways to create our own protections, though perhaps with a little less discomfort. As we bring this bizarre tale of medieval sleepers' cages to a close, it's worth reflecting on the broader lessons we can learn from such a strange practice. When we look at history, it's easy to focus on the material objects, tools, machines, and structures, but what they really represent is something far deeper. The sleepers' cages weren't just uncomfortable prisons, they were a physical manifestation of the human condition. They reflect a time when fear, whether of the supernatural, criminals, or the unknown, was so pervasive that it influenced even the most intimate aspects of life, like sleep. This practice serves as a stark reminder of how different life could be in medieval times, where uncertainty and danger were constants. Our world today may be far more advanced in terms of technology, medicine, and safety, but the underlying human need for security hasn't changed. As much as we may dismiss the idea of being locked into a cage while we sleep, many of us still find ourselves seeking comfort in various forms of protection, whether it's a security system, a locked door, or even an emotional barrier we place around ourselves at night. The fascination with these cages also speaks to our need to control our environments and our bodies. In the medieval period, people found it necessary to control even their sleep to ensure that they could survive another day. Today, while the means may be different, the desire for control, over our physical spaces, our emotional well-being, and even our dreams, remains universal. The cages are long gone, but the anxiety that led to their creation still lingers in various forms. Perhaps, in a way, they represent our collective desire for control over the uncontrollable. Historians still debate whether this practice was rooted in genuine fear or whether it was simply a cultural response to the chaos of the medieval world. Some argue that it was a practical solution to real threats, while others believe it was more a reflection of a mindset that prioritized control over comfort. Either way, the legacy of the sleepers' cages lives on, as a strange but fascinating chapter in the history of human survival, safety, and the deep, sometimes irrational, need to protect ourselves from the world around us. As we finally come to the end of our exploration of medieval sleepers' cages, let's take a moment to reflect on how far we've come. The cages, once so central to the concept of protection and control, have become oddities of history, symbols of a bygone era when safety was a constant worry and sleep was a vulnerable act. But as we sit comfortably in our beds, surrounded by the modern comforts of life, it's easy to forget that the idea of a peaceful night's sleep was once a luxury, not a given. Today, we have created our own methods of controlling our sleep environment, whether it's through advanced security systems, sound machines, or even sleep tracking apps. While we may no longer be physically confined to metal or wooden cages, the need for a sense of security remains. It's almost as if, in the rush to modernize, we've forgotten the anxiety that once plagued the night. The fear of the unknown still exists in subtle ways, but we've replaced the physical cages with more psychological ones, ways of ensuring we feel safe, even if the danger we feared no longer exists. The medieval sleepers' cages, though long gone, remind us of the lengths people once went to in order to safeguard themselves during a time of constant fear and uncertainty. They tell a story of survival, of human resilience in the face of danger, and of a society that found comfort in controlling even the most fundamental parts of life. Today, we may not be sleeping in cages, but the need for control, security, and peace remains deeply ingrained in us. As you lie down tonight, in your soft bed, with the comfort of knowing you're safe, take a moment to think about the past. The people who once relied on these strange contraptions for security no longer walk among us, but their fears, and their solutions, echo through time. Let those thoughts drift away like the fading remnants of a forgotten nightmare, leaving only the peacefulness of the present.